one of the stories that is consistent throughout the day's proceedings has been the challenge of telling the national story. And now I think many in the audience would like to hear from the economists themselves, from those who are working for the worldwide brand that is The Economist, and try and get a better understanding of what the challenges have been in creating a summit in this country, choosing Toronto as a venue, and beyond that, really looking at the question of when we hear the disadvantages that we're facing, the lack of venture capitalism, perhaps the humility of the Canadian psyche that doesn't allow us to take the entrepreneurial risks, what is one thing each of the panelists would recommend after the conversations of today to improve the lot of the business story of Canada? So Madelaine, you've been here the longest in terms of Canada, so
I'm going
we'll give you the easy
I'm going
chance.
to defer to my colleagues while I think about that, because that's a tough one.
I mean, for me, it does come to your point about storytelling. I mean, it seems to me that there are amazing stories out there that, about entrepreneurship, for example, that even the entrepreneurs themselves don't know of each other's existence and each other's stories. And just telling those stories and celebrating those entrepreneurs could fundamentally change how the entrepreneurs perceive their opportunity within Canada and how Canada perceives itself as a country and a culture and nature of its people. So I feel like that actually I'm struck by how much is already happening that is just not being acknowledged.
I bring a slightly different perspective because I began my journalism career in Canada, and listening to the stories today, they sound a lot like stories I heard a lot of 20 years ago when I worked for the National Post and the Globe and Mail. A lot of angst about the lack of entrepreneurs, the fact that the best and brightest would go to the United States, the excess of dependence on the United States and on oil. And here we are 20 years later, and frankly, it doesn't look like Canada has suffered a lot relative to its peer groups for this supposed lack of entrepreneurialism. And working in the United States, as I have for the last 15 or 16 years, you realize how unique the United States is. Every country wants a Silicon Valley. The Swedes and the Norwegians and the Israelis and the British, they all wish they could have that same degree of entrepreneurialism. That same debate goes on in every country. At some point, you have to realize what an outlier the United States is. And relative to the non-US peer group, Canada does extremely well. There are a lot of entrepreneurs in this country. I was struck, I can't remember who said it, but said that Canada doesn't have a problem with entrepreneurs and startups. It has a problem with taking those companies up to scale. But in that same conversation was observed how many of these companies then get snapped up for multi-billion-dollar valuations by the Oracles of the world. That's not a bad outcome. Being bought by Oracle is not a bad outcome for a Canadian startup. And it's not like all those brains flee Canada and they no longer benefit Canadians. What I think, my takeaway from today's conversation is that Canada has to accept that living next to this amazing engine of entrepreneurialism, that you're going to constantly lose some of your best and brightest to that thing. And the challenge for Canada is to constantly be cultivating and refreshing the supply of new ideas so that you never actually lack for people creating those new ideas. That's why human capital and immigration are so important.
Okay, I'll come up with something. No, I was reminded when I think it was Ed Clark talked about complacency, although I'm not sure that he used that exact word. But then there was a lot of stress as well on having different groups and different levels of government try to talk to each other and get their act together. And I think over the whole commodity boom, things have been going quite well for Canada. And, as Greg was saying, we haven't done that badly as well. But I think now when conditions turn against us, that's the time where you're really going to find out. You need everybody to pull together at that point, and I don't get the sense from hearing from people that everybody's actually pulling together right now in Canada.
Yeah, I think it's a country of regional tensions. I think for the first time in our history, the Canadian economy is proving to be disadvantageous to Ontario. That is seismic. The bounty revenues of Alberta, the potential 180 billion in flow from LNG that is perhaps going to come to reality in British Columbia. It's a new era in many respects. But how do you take the challenge of entrepreneurship, which I suppose fits into innovation, connects into the changing and sad story at the moment around manufacturing, and apply it against perhaps the greatest potential we have, which is our people, and connect them in a way that you have a national policy. Can it be achieved, or are we destined to be stories about Alberta, stories about BC, and stories about Ontario? Can you tie a national story together?
I'll take a stab at this one. So a piece I wrote for the Globe and Mail when I worked there many years ago actually looked at the tectonic changes that had happened in the flow of trade between Canada, within Canada versus between Canada and the United States just in the years since the free trade agreement took place. And what I had found was that the flow of trades had shifted from being predominantly east-west to predominantly north-south. And you could say, well, this weakens the ties that bind Canada. But it was really just economic forces doing what economic forces will when artificial barriers to trade are broken down, when technology and language and institutions allow those flows to open up across borders. And Canada is not a weaker country for it. So maybe I spent too many years at The Economist, but when I hear people say we need a national policy for entrepreneurialism, my hackles go up. I don't see why we need a national policy if the market is getting the signals right and telling people where to go. If we have a lack of, I look around and I see, are there artificial barriers to entrepreneurs that we need to remove? You know, so for example, we had a conversation with with a gentleman from the IMF earlier, with Aditya Narain and David Rawlings from JP Morgan, Koji Asada from Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi. And it was an interesting perspective because 93% of Canadian bank assets are controlled by 6 banks, and they weren't part of those 6 banks, all right? And Canadians are very proud of the fact that this oligopolistic, competitive oligopoly saw them through the financial crisis very well. But Canadians also need to confront the downsides of a system that is so cozy. Americans, it's not a great thing about America that they have financial crises, but those crises are the consequences of an incredibly competitive and innovative financial system, which has private equity, it has mezzanine financing, it has medium-term notes, it has venture capital, it has finance companies, a lot of which grew up in the cracks between the regulations and therefore gave us a financial crisis in the United States, but also gave us incredibly vigorous level of entrepreneurial activity. So I think that is an interesting policy question. Have Canadians, in the effort to strike a balance between growth and stability, have Canadians pushed it too far towards the stability side and away from the growth side?
I mean, I think I'm also struck by the fact that America doesn't have a national innovation policy or anything of that kind that's in any sense meaningful. I mean, Silicon Valley really became a byword for what America does, but there's many cities across America that are not at all innovative and are just creating their first hubs and trying to figure it all out. So I don't know, I'm not sure that a national story is really required. And actually a federal system, one of the strengths of it is arguably the competition, and maybe your point about Ontario being at a disadvantage because of the success of Alberta. Well, the petrocurrency plunging earthwards may help you with that problem and provide a more balanced situation in the next few years.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as you were saying that even as we're sitting here, things might be sort of righting themselves. Well, righting makes it sound like that's the correct thing, but that the economic shifts may, in fact, right now be going the other way. And in another year, if oil prices stay really low, we might be looking again at central Canada as being the engine of the economy. It is a strength of Canada that different provinces can balance each other out in terms of how well they're doing. And the other thing, I wouldn't want to play up too much the sort of rivalries between the provinces. We like to do that in the media, because it makes a good story. But they often work together and don't get any coverage at all. I was always struck by the fact of, you'd hear about these meetings of the premiers and find out that, Quebec and Alberta were really tight and working for the same things, and you wouldn't know that from reading the media coverage. So, I don't think Canada is in such bad shape.
It was a big day today for the Alberta and Ontario governments, where they agreed to, from the Wynne government, to waive the climate change calculations from the Eastern Pipeline. So I think the Alberta Premier has gone away happy, and the Globe will play that up tomorrow on page 3. Okay. If we can move away from the United States and the domestic Canadian question for a moment, I'm struck when I'm asked if I was to open another foreign bureau, where would it be? And my instant answer is there are 2 places. One of them happens to be in the States. It's California, and the second one is Hong Kong. And people say, well, why those 2? And it's because if by population alone you were to look at them, they are the 6th and 7th provinces of Canada. There are 500,000 Canadians in LA. They have a deep engagement. The Hong Kong connection is obviously one well told on the Western Seaboard. But for Canada to be a global player, where should it focus its eyes? It's Asia to an extent, but can you navigate us through the journey in terms of what it is that Canada can do or should do in order to be that global player, and what would it be the global leader in if it were to do so, if it's not already?
Well, I was very struck by Rupert's comments at lunchtime, where he was really talking about the sense of having America on the doorstep has been a way of almost like condemning yourself to feeling inadequate. Whereas, in fact, if you look at all these other nations around the world that are much smaller, there's just huge opportunities there. And actually, they may be a lot less competitive than America. And he was talking about the Middle East as an opportunity, and there's clearly a lot of growth going there. I mean, I think it's interesting that Africa actually does seem to be on a fairly strong growth path at the moment. And you hear a lot of Americans talking about investing in Africa, but I'm not really sure they're serious about it in most cases in terms of moving serious amounts of money. Maybe there are opportunities there, and particularly, your people from Quebec and the whole Francophone Africa is available there as an obvious advantage that you would have over American rivals. So I think there's lots of opportunities, but even Europe, I think, is because they're so beaten up in Europe at the moment. Maybe there are opportunities there to innovate that the Europeans have just lost the will to live, and so you basically have to go in and sort of you can sort of surprise them by how many opportunities there are there.
Greg?
So one of the reasons that Canada depends so much on the United States for trade is because historically trade was about physical stuff, things you could drop on your foot. But as was discussed earlier today, trade is getting lighter, more lightweight. Increasingly, the things that we sell across borders don't weigh anything. They're made up of ones and zeros. They're digital code. They're movies, films, and other products of essentially their intellectual property products. And that starts to kill distance as a factor in trade. And that then raises the question, well, once you weaken that, what does it do to the gravitational pull on Canada's trade patterns? And you go back to the human capital issue, and the fact that Canada, by virtue of its openness to immigrants, which is truly an institutional advantage over the United States right now, has these cultural connections to countries like India, like China, like all around the world. And once these people get into services that are exportable, and I'm talking not just about software, but also about engineering and architectural services, right? You can now collaborate with a partner in Shanghai and design a skyscraper from Montreal or Toronto. So I would say that those are the places you want to look. You want to actually look internally to the people that you have already within your borders and ask them, what do your people in the country where you came from, or that your friends or your old college buddies talk about? Just tell me what it is you think we could be doing that they want, because we no longer have to give 15% of our revenue to a customs broker to get it across the border. We just have to zap it in an email. So the evolution of trade away from physical to intellectual, I think, perfectly meshes with Canada's advantage on the human capital front and the existing and growing bonds it has culturally with so much of the rest of the world.
Just to pick up on that, I did some research it's 5 or 6 years ago, where I was trying to find some studies looking into the economic impact of multiculturalism in Canada. Not so much in Canada, but whether or not companies were leveraging that for their business abroad, and I couldn't find anything. at the time. Now, I haven't looked more recently to see, but it seems to me it would fit perfectly with what Greg's saying, is if there is more of an effort by companies themselves to use the people they have and see where that goes, rather than just picking, oh yeah, we've got to do China or we have to do Africa or something like that. We could do the world, really.
There was the example that Rupert brought up, I think, of the Indian-Canadian employee who opened up their Indian business. Yeah. Now, I don't know whether they decided to open an Indian business because they had an Indian-Canadian employee, but definitely that was clearly having that human capital asset help facilitate that transaction.
It's a big difference. We've got a few minutes left. I'd like to open it to the floor. If there is anyone who has a question for our distinguished colleagues, please, up at the front here. Yeah, whoever's closest there. We'll come to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, David. It's a media panel of sorts here. You started by referring to the sad story that's Canadian manufacturing. And Madelaine, you talked a little bit about the responsibility to tell both sides of the story. I agree that telling success stories is key to moving us forward here. And what role can you play in the media to help get those, and what responsibility do you have to get those stories out there? I work with an awful lot of small to mid-sized companies across Canada, and the success stories are enormous, including in manufacturing right now. There's a lot of reshoring happening. There's a lot of great innovation. So what's the responsibility of media to get out there and tell those good stories as well?
I'll take that first. We have to structurally change the way we do our reporting. We focus so much on the market movers and the 5,000 large corporations of the country, and not the millions involved in the small businesses. We do have a good relationship when we get into small businesses, because there is an appreciation of the culture change. And particularly, I love the stories around the second generation family taking over and having to tell dad that he's all wrong. It has to be done differently. And that is instructive. So it's sad in the sense that there are a lot of jobs have been lost. It is sad in the sense of the challenges, but it is absolutely, and Greg made this point, it is key that we don't make it sound like we're falling off a cliff. So I want to ensure that the coverage does pull onto the reins and provides at least a level of scrutiny that is fair on both sides of that. But I'm actually internally changing the structure so that the ROB does a better job of reflecting that.
Just in general with the news, it's very difficult, or let me put it this way, it's more difficult to sell a good news story than it is to sell a bad news story. I mean, that is just the nature. We like to report on bad news. People like to read bad news as well. So it's harder to get the good news story out. And I would flip it around and say it's also incumbent on the people trying to tell their good news story to try and tell it in an interesting way to the media, rather than doing sort of, a fluffy presentation that nobody is going to buy. So I think it takes a bit more thought sometimes from the people trying to sell the story into how does this hook into a broader story, a global story. For The Economist, it has to be that. It can't just be one little business in Toronto doing a good job. It has to be, this is how it works into the broader Canadian story and maybe into the global picture as well.
Okay, the enemy of time is fast approaching, so we'll come to your same question. Okay.
I mean, I also suspect, though, that a lot of the storytelling needs to be done at a smaller level than the mainstream media. That actually it needs to be done by the C100, telling all the stories to their network. It needs to be done by the Association of Chief Executives, and others. So that actually, the people actually involved in business and entrepreneurship actually know the stories, because, I think my sense is that isn't even broadly, that narrative is not broadly known. Now, if you then have a whole community that is quite excited about what's going on, I think that tends to bubble through to the media eventually. And so it becomes, and you can also then draw on a whole load of sources who will confirm the story, which is not the case.
I mean, I'll certainly say that we have to be part of the solution. The media is not about just adversarial. We have to be part of the solution.